You know,
Good way to do it.
you grab one, tell them back when you did it, never do that. This. You did. You're gonna fall. Yeah, I see it happen all the time. People fall. Yep. We haven't need once. One time.
So you wear a helmet and that collar.
Probably should wear eye protection, I'll tell you that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
There were people out there.
All right, well, let's get started. We're meeting here today with Bill Holmes, who's a classmate of mine at Louisville. And I'll start off with a little bit of an introduction, and then he's going to talk for, he said maybe 3 minutes, and I said, milk it to 10. And then we're going to open it to questions and comments and just sort of a discussion. It's a book that doesn't lend itself to a review to me. Bill sent me a copy of this book in 2018 when it was published, and I was just fascinated by the stories that he told and the path about him. Now, let me tell you, I met Bill in the fall, in the fall of 1966, orientation for medical school at the University of Louisville. Bill, sort of like what you see now, he was standing up. He's a very distinguished looking young man, then old man now, and he was well dressed, obviously good manners, and everybody was exchanging, where are you from, where'd you go to school? And Bill said, I grew up in Louisville, graduated from Vanderbilt, and I said, another damn rich Louisville kid. and that was sort of it. In the first 2 years, the one thing that I'd forgotten, besides that, was I knew Bill. You know, we went to class together, but I lived with a sophomore way off campus. I don't know where Bill lived that first year, but I studied alone. I don't know if Bill studied alone or not. I got married after my first year. Bill got married semester or our Christmas break of our second year. So we've been married.
Third year.
Is that right? And
Third year.
but I didn't know him. Clinical rotations, we had no clinical rotations together, so I didn't know him. I knew at graduation he was going into a pediatric internship, and I didn't stay real close to the class for a long time. And I said in what I wrote down, I think we met up again at the first or second. It may have been the second reunion I went to. I think I went to the 35th reunion and the 40th. And from what I remember about it, if I remember my facts correctly, when I talked to Bill, I found out that he had gone into pediatrics. Didn't tell me about his 3-month residency in psychiatry at Barnes Hospital in St. Joe after his pediatric residency. He bailed then and came back to Louisville and did pediatrics at University of Louisville, at the Children's Hospital and the Kosar Hospital. Practiced 4 years of general pediatrics, and then an opening came available at the UK Medical Center in Lexington in the pediatric neurology section. And he went and did a 3-year fellowship right in Lexington. And he came back and he was the pediatric neurologist in Lexington, in Louisville. Was on the faculty, taught, set up peripheral clinics for the towns that a lot of them didn't have pediatrics, much less pediatric neurologists. And so I found that out, and I think the time that the first time we talked, when I came back to a reunion, he told me that he was going back to seminary, and he was retired or was going to retire from his pediatric neurology practice. And I said, back to seminary? He said, yeah. I said, I went to seminary for 1 year after Vanderbilt. And again, what I remember him telling me was that, one of his professors there that he was close to around midway in that first year, he said, Bill, I understand that you weren't sure whether you want to go to seminary or medical school. You go here 6 months. I think medical school would be a real good fit for you. And so he came in to medical school. I didn't know that. So I was impressed. He was going to be, and then he was going to be a hospital chaplain. Hell, you retired, you're going to retire. Why do you want to go back to work? Anyway, I didn't know. And in 2018, he sent me a copy of this book, and I loved it. I mean, it's an unlikely story in our, I think in our profession for somebody to take this role. But anyway, and when I read the book, I found out he wasn't another rich Louisville kid. And, but I was mesmerized by the book. I think this is the book that partly because it's cheap. I bought a lot and given a lot of these copies away to other people. But I found it, and I read it. This is, I think, the third time I've read it. At least I've got 3 different colors of highlighters in the book, and that tells me I read it 3 times. So I found out I didn't know it. First impressions are often wrong, and boy, was I wrong on Bill. I had no idea about that 1 year in the wilderness that he talks about, and I'm interested. If you don't cover that, I will with my questions. I have several about that. In 98, I think, he said, I'm burnt out, I can't do this. He was the super doc, first at the hospital, last to get home. And a lot of us, or some of us, can at least think in parts of our career that we were workaholics. I think maybe ophthalmology doesn't exist.
Easy.
But for the rest of us, you can get caught up in that complex. And then I hope you read the CV. Did you read the CV? Did you like that first honor that he noted? 5th grade spelling bee winner.
Did you notice that
he kept his copy of Huckleberry Finn somewhere behind you, I'm sure.
Did you notice he went to Manly Junior High and Male High School?
Male High
I
School.
don't know what that means. I just thought.
Well, Male was one of the big.
There it is.
It was one of the largest public high schools in Louisville, and male sports were huge. He'll tell the story of how he got involved with the church, which I think is really interesting. Lay persons coming to him after he cut his arm and told him to come to Sunday school. If he did, he could be on the Baptist basketball and softball team, and he was saved. Right then. Anyway, when I read his book, I learned a lot more about him, and that's really why we're here. And I hope you all enjoy it as much as I did. I've talked to some of you who really have, other who are non-spiritual and. No, I'm joking. I'm not. But anyway, so Bill is a neat guy, and he certainly put together differently than me, liking to do different things. We have one person in our group, Bill, Jack McCallum, who will be on in just a minute, who, like you, after he retired, he went back to and got his PhD in history. Has written 2 big books, and has a memory that's watertight for nearly everything. But the rest, well, for myself. When I retired, whatever. So that's Bill Holmes. And Bill, say what you want to say, and then we're going to fire some questions at
Okay, I'm done.
you.
First of all, John was #1 in our class, so he was the smart guy. So I didn't have much to say to him, but simply because I didn't think he would understand what us dumb folks were talking about. But John, it was we got married. Joyce and I got married between between OB and surgery rotation the junior year, because that was the only time we had. So at Christmas time, she was my wife for 55 years, and she passed away last summer with Alzheimer's and a stroke. So, I'm a little bit, I've only talked to one other physician group about this book, and was here at the University of Louisville a few years ago. And I don't know if it went well or not, because no one told me. So if I stumble around, it's not likely I'll stumble that much, because I grew up Baptist, and Baptists talk a lot. I'm a Baptitarian at this point in my life, I guess. But as this title says, the book was really just a collection of thoughts that I accumulated in some other form over time. In fact, I kept a notebook for about 20 years or so called Scribblings. Isn't that exciting looking? So, and the pages are all hanging out too. And I would just put stuff in there that I wrote or thoughts that I had. Should not be likened to Pascal's Pensées, that was not quite in his league. Some of the stuff that appeared in the book I'd written that for other publications, and they were modified and put in there. So much of what you see in the book came from that time. And as John already said, even before the ink was dry in 2017 and was published in 2018, there were areas that I would want to change, and even more that I want to change now. But the whole process started after I retired from child neurology in 2007. I went to the seminary at Louisville Presbyterian. It came down between the Louisville Presbyterian Seminary and the Southern Baptist Seminary, and I had friends on both faculties, and they voted and told me I needed to go to Presbyterian. So that's where I ended up on advice. So it was at the time I was already, as a student, I started pastoring a small Presbyterian rural church in North Clark, Indiana, just north of here. And but that was after 37 years in medicine and 4 years in the seminary. And I was an expert. I knew everything, still do for that matter, but some of it I've forgotten. You don't believe that. I went in, and as say in the book, I went in this direction. I was interested in that when I left Vanderbilt and went to the seminary. It was actually Wayne Oates was the person who persuaded me to leave seminary. He was professor of pastoral care at Southern Seminary. He later left the seminary and joined the faculty of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Louisville. But one of the things I often struggled with was the identity issue. Was I really a chaplain? I would sometimes say I was never a real chaplain, but they called me that because I also had some training for it as well. But I headed in that direction because of actually the great respect that I came to in dealing with chaplains at the hospital. I remember, I think I mentioned this in the book, I'm not sure. I remember on a Christmas day in 1992, a little girl came into the children's ER with a stroke and developed significant cerebral edema right away. And I came in to see her. Neurosurgery was there. And basically, I was at the hospital all day on Christmas Day, but also noticed there was also a chaplain there the whole time. And I'd come into the ER at 2 in the morning or 4 in the morning on patients that were dying, and I would find a chaplain on call. And I had a kid in the ICU who was dying at 4 o'clock in the morning from cerebral edema. And when I got there, the chaplain was already there. And I began to see this group of people who were quite dedicated to the spiritual welfare of the patients, their families, and the staff. And in fact, they were there for the staff as much as they were for the patients. So I've gone through struggles. I have a lot of chaplain friends, and one of them told me that I was actually an interloper, that I was not a real chaplain. I was still a physician dressed in chaplain's clothes, and whatever that means. But I was chaplain for 9 years at Norton Brownsboro Hospital, which has a heavy neuro program. And so a lot of what I did was with neuro-oncology patients and a neurosurgical staff of 8. So you can see how busy the place was. And it was story after story, not all of which got into the book, of course. But I guess first question, what did I do as a chaplain, particularly as a former physician? My main job was to come to the bedside and listen and speak only if it was necessary. I didn't come to take a history, and I didn't come to make a medical decision, although I must admit that in the back of my mind, I was often taking a history and making a medical decision. And I just didn't make it publicly known. I did have one incident where it did cause a little problem. They asked me to see a mother in the ICU who was quite upset over her older daughter's status. And I walked into the room, and she said, well, my daughter just is very nervous. She keeps shaking. And I looked over at her and I said, what are you shaking? Are you referring to? She says, that in her right hand. Well, I looked closely and I touched her and I said, ma'am, it's not shaking. And I walked back out of the room and told the nurse to please call the neurologist on call because his patient was in focal motor status. And that got me in trouble with the chief chaplain anyway. But it was to the patient's advantage, but it was hard to negotiate that sometimes. But the main thing was trying to keep my focus away from doing the medical part, which I finally learned to do that. The trips into the ER or various places, it was keeping my mind clear of what the medical issue was. I wanted to go in. I didn't really care what the diagnosis was. The problems spiritually were often the same, no matter what the medical issue was. Looking back at those early years, I'm not the same person now who wrote the book, and at least let me put it, I'm not entirely the same. So I would probably change in certain ways, and even the cases that I would cite. Now, I'm not going to go through every page in the book, unless you'd like for me to. Would you like me to? No, you would not. Unless do you have no dose in you this morning? Did you take enough caffeine before you? What time is it in Texas?
An hour earlier.
An hour earlier than here. By the way, I was just through Dallas on my way to Phoenix to go to the Dodgers spring training camp. The Dodgers catcher, Will Smith, grew up in my neighborhood. And my daughter taught him how to play the guitar, but Will quit guitar early so he could focus on baseball. A good move on his part. 8.8 million this year, but he's batting right behind a guy was making 70 million a year. So he's still, I guess, a relative failure in baseball, relatively speaking. He's batting 282 in spring training, I think, right now. But when I started doing the chaplaincy, I had to figure out how I was going to handle what I did. So what I did each morning was I got to the hospital usually. When I was in practice, I was at the hospital at 5:30 or 6 each morning because the neurosurgeons made rounds in the ICU at 6, and I had to make rounds with them. we had to tell them where to cut. If y'all know any pediatric neurosurgeons, you have to give them distinct instructions. Are there any neurosurgeons here? So
Yes.
I'm only joking now. You know that, don't you? But my habit was to go first to the emergency department, then I'd go to pre-op area and surgery, and then to the ICU just to see if there's anything going on that needed attention. And one of the things that I noticed that is, as physicians, we walk into the ICU or the ER, and it's just room after room of just people gathered around people. And we see the legs sticking out from under the curtain. We see the nurses going in and out, but we forget that there's a story going on in there, that something is unfolding that to you and I would be familiar stuff, but to them was a mystery, a challenge, something that was frightening, or as my friend theologian Walter Brueggemann calls it, a time of disorientation. And I'll come back to that later, but you would see people standing around the Hill Rom. I wished I owned some stock in Hill Rom, but I don't. They've sold a lot of stuff. But you see them scurrying in and out. And I remember one of my first visits, I came into the ICU. No, it wasn't the ICU, it was a regular bed. And I looked in and there was a guard in there and it said Kentucky State Reformatory. And what it was in the bed was a prisoner from the reformatory, which is about 20 miles from the hospital. And he was handcuffed to the bed. Although he was frail, he was wasted, and he was dying from cancer. He couldn't have escaped if he wanted to, but the guy was following regs. And out in the hall was this gathering of folks who wanted to go in to see him, but the guard had told them no more than 2 at a time, and you could stay for 5 minutes and then get out. And that was how I could see how they would have something like that if this was a dangerous prisoner. But lucky for me, one of the guys I grew up with was a guy named Wayne Dunn, and Wayne had a title. It was director of corrections for the state of Kentucky, and on my phone was Wayne's cell phone. So a call to Wayne, and we had it fixed so that more than a few people could go in to see this dying man. And I don't know how any of you are acquainted, or if you are Pentecostal in your background, but if you know, our Pentecostal friends like to pray together, like all at one time sometimes. And I went into the room and asked the mother, who was quite ill in the first place, if she would like to have prayer for her son. And then made another mistake. I volunteered to do the prayer. And as I started to pray, everybody started to pray. And in a very acceptable Pentecostal tradition. It was my introduction to Pentecostalism in a hospital setting, and it went on for several other times in my life. So there I was, the old Baptist, educated by the Presbyterians, starting to pray with the Pentecostals, and it was my first lesson in how not to do that. I could go on with stories along that line, but I thought I want to say, because I mentioned in the book the importance of Scripture, and there's one chapter that I've entitled "Psalms on the Ground," and so I will stick my neck out here a little bit. I think that probably one of the greatest bodies of literature that we have accumulated is that in the Hebrew literature, and particularly the wisdom literature, and particularly the Psalms. It's real people with real stories and their reaction to the fears of impending death or being destroyed. It was not imagined. It was quite real. And I think the Psalms probably speak more than anything to people in hospital settings because of the fear and anxiety. There are parts of the Psalms that are called the Psalms of Lament, in which people are crying out to God because they are so upset and distressed in what's going on with them. And I often took the opportunity to read those, and it's often noting how often people responded to that because it spoke to where they were in their thinking. Someone asked me once if, the question, what would you take with you if you were going to be placed in isolation on some island somewhere for the rest of your life? I would take the Psalms first, and probably after that, a few Kentucky poets. Well, Wendell Berry for one, but I have a good friend who teaches at Transylvania College in Lexington, but he lives in a rural area, Maurice Manning. Maurice has a wit about him. He is from a rural area, not as rural as West Texas, I don't think. I have a friend in West Texas who said she could watch her dog run away for a year because it's so flat there. But he starts out one poem that but became meaningful in the context even of ministry, that it's called "The Gone and the Going Away." The world I know keeps going farther and farther away. I cannot keep it from going, though I love it still, and yet with darker joy. The dark because that world was soaked in sadness. The joy because I understood, and I lived there too. It's that simple. Sometimes love can stay on the heart in such a time and place and turn to fiercer love, to love beyond all understanding of the name. He goes on for several more pages. He does write short poems, but they're usually funnier than that. But the Kentucky poets, for me, capture a lot of what people experience in life, and that's why I've learned to start reading them and try to figure out what they were saying. But so back to the Psalms. We got off on Maurice Manning. I think the psalmist spoke very much of what we, particularly people in distress, need to hear and to sense. The Psalms speak, I think, every day to where we are and speak of a God who allows you to get into his face and to say what you want to say. Look at things like Psalm 13, in which the psalmist cries out, where have you been? And where did you go? I'm having trouble here, but no one's listening. That sounds like my kids growing up and my grandchildren now, especially my oldest one who's heading off to college and thinks the world's going to come to an end if she doesn't do well. So I think often what we hear is silence, and often silence is actually the answer. The problem is us hearing what the answer may be on our own. If you notice on the book, the foreword's written by Walter Brueggemann. If you're not a theologian, you won't know that Walter's probably the foremost Old Testament theologian alive right now. And I've known him for about 10 years. I met him at something where we were having a dinner, and we were the last two in line and the only two seats left. So I got to sit next to him and we became friends. And it's been, so he said he would read the book, and I think he read it. I'm not sure he did or not, but he said he did before he wrote this. But Brueggemann has written a book called The Message of the Psalms. And his point is that, and I mentioned this earlier, that the trauma of life brings us to a time of disorientation. You go and tell someone they have cancer. By the way, I've had cancer of the bladder and cancer of the prostate diagnosed at the same time, January the 4th, 2010. And then 2011, it was changes in my colon. They did a partial colectomy. And in 2016, smoldering multiple myeloma, for which I've done well. I'm seen over at UK at the Markey Cancer Center, because there's a guru over there. So you always go where the gurus are, who know more about it than the average hematologist, I guess. But he talks about disorientation, that you're thrown into a state of not knowing where things are anymore, that your whole life gets turned around, and makes the point that you never go back to where you were. Once you know you have cancer, for instance, life changes, and you may survive, but you are never again the person that you were before, or your relationships change, sometimes subtly, sometimes quite prominently. And that's kind of what I was getting at when the book on, and when I talk about cancer in the book. I'm trying to think what else I could mention here if you want me to go on, but somebody asked me, why did I put a chapter on poverty in here? I grew up in the inner city of Louisville. Actually, we grew up all over the place. My parents never owned a house and never owned a car, and they were apartment dwellers. We lived in 11 different places before I went off to college at Vanderbilt. And one of the things that happened where we live is they built Interstate 65 right across the street from our house and put the ramp through our backyard, the ramp to St. Catherine Street. And that wouldn't happen to people who had money. It just would not happen. But in that whole area, there is a good deal of poverty. And so my answer to the question why is that because poverty is basically about suffering. And I believe that a fully developed notion of who is God, question that I'm still asking at the ripe old age, I'll be 81 in June. You see suffering around you, and there's some response to it, but what is that response? The prophets in the Hebrew scripture, I grew up Southern Baptist. So if you asked me to quote a Bible verse growing up before seminary, you quoted most often. You would quote John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Now you live in Texas. You've probably heard that in Texas somewhere, haven't you? Yeah, because the thumb just went up. Okay. But when I entered seminary, I remember the dean stood up on day one, and he quoted this verse, and this is reading from the Jewish Study Bible, the Tanakh translation from the Jewish Publication Society, and see if anybody recognizes it, from Micah. And he says, I had told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God. Then your name will achieve wisdom. And I was always struck by that the idea was to do justice, but it's not unlike really what Jesus had said in Matthew, in Matthew 25, and he told his disciples that they had seen him and given him food and clothing, and goes through a whole litany along that line. And they said, well, when did that happen? And they said, whenever you saw anybody. So it raises the question, who is God? Where is God? And if you're interested in reading another new book, The Human-Shaped God is won the Grawemeyer Award. It's given by Presbyterian Seminary and the University of Louisville. It's written by Charles Halton, who now is a priest in the Episcopal Church in Lexington, Kentucky. But one of the points he brings out is, where is God? God is in the suffering that we see. So I would say to all of you who have been taking care of suffering people all your lives, congratulations on a life of ministry, because that's what you've been doing. You just didn't call it that, perhaps. So I think there is, you don't have to go out and seek a formal theological basis for what you do, but a lot of you have been doing some sort of theology and practicing it your whole life. You just didn't call it that. That's my opinion. You don't have to agree with that. In fact, you don't have to agree with anything I say. You can jump all over me if you wish. Last remark here. John, have I gone long enough for you?
Well, wait a minute, I woke up. No, go ahead. Finish, go ahead.
just last remark here. My biggest struggle in life and through all these things with medicine, and if there's one chapter in here that I'd like to redo and maybe halfway throw out, is chapter 6 on hope, because I've learned that I don't know what hope is. Everybody has, I think we talk about hope, and sometimes I think we're talking about good thoughts, and certainly in medicine, we're talking about clinical hope. We're thinking about what can medicine do for me? What can it cure me? So what I'm working on now is working on something on hope that WJK Press is looking at and following along with me. It may or may not ever get published, but I hope it will. Where I grew up on Brook Street, as I told you before, they put the expressway in front of the house and the ramp in back. Well, expressway ramps provide great shelter for homeless people. And under the ramp that was going through our backyard, I was driving by one day and I looked up there and it looked like there were people sleeping. And I drove my car down the alley, which is quite narrow, and I just kind of yelled out to them. And I heard a voice yell back, and it was not nice at first, but eventually came down. There was a tall guy and a short person. I thought it was two guys, and the short guy turned out to be a woman with her hair up. She informed me that her friend was, in fact, she says he has the schizophrenia, whatever that meant. So I just inquired if they were hungry or not, and could I get them some food. There was a hamburger restaurant, very popular in the neighborhood, called the Dizzy Whiz. And they said, no, we want rallies. So I said, rallies it is. So we got some rallies. I went over and got some. I didn't think, they thought I wasn't going to come back, I'm sure. And I brought back their rallies, hamburgers, and their Cokes. And then I offered him a small amount of cash. And she looked up, she says, is this some sort of trick? What are you up to? And she was convinced that I may be a cop. Although I think I was in a suit that day because I'd been at a meeting that required me looking like I came from the seat of power, so I wore my suit. But I remember calling out to those folks, and a reminder of if you remember the scripture, the John 11, the Lazarus who was quote asleep, and he had been called forth from the tomb by Jesus in that story. And I remember thinking when I first heard that story of calling forth Lazarus. And I was calling to these people who I didn't know if they were alive or not up in the top. If you could see this place, the ledges that are under expressway ramps is where they were sleeping. I think they have since modified that ramp, which really deprives somebody of a place to sleep at night, where they wouldn't get wet. But I thought of Lazarus, and the way we give hope in an affluent society is we call out to other people who are having a difficult time for whatever reason it may be. When in our society, the reason I am alive today is because I am white, I'm fairly wealthy, and I'm well insured. Because as I was talking to a lady at the drugstore, she's the one who brings up the cash register or gets your prescriptions in the pharmacy at Kroger. And we were talking about vaccines, and she said, I didn't get one. I said, why did you not? She says, I don't have any insurance. And so she said, I didn't get a vaccine. And I wonder how many other people are in that same position, but that I'm getting off track there too with that story. But I think one of the way we give hope to people is we offer community. We come to be with them when they're needing something, but we stay with them and offer community. Even we accept them for who they are. We're in a society that judges everybody, and we exclude on the basis of one thing or the other. By the way, speaking of excluding on one basis or the other, by confession, I'm a Democrat. But my next door neighbor, 2 doors down really, is Larry Cox. Larry ran Mitch McConnell's office for 25 years. Does anybody there not know who Mitch McConnell is? Okay, good. Well, you've never heard of Mitch McConnell. Yes. Okay. But Mitch is retiring. But Larry has run, but Larry and I, if we got together and started on our political notes, we get wide apart. But it's 33 years we've been neighbors, and there are no bullet holes in my house, nor have I kicked in his door. And I helped him catch the moles that were invading his yard last year. And he came over and took out a fallen tree in my backyard with his buzzsaw, because he's an old country boy and he knows how to use his chainsaw. And I could cut my hand off with one. But we found a way to talk to each other and be neighbors. And despite our political differences, he even had me come to his Methodist church Sunday school class to talk to his class. And what I think our hope is really in somehow establishing community. And that's one of the things I try to get to in one parts of the book. And I'm going to shut up because I've talked more than you probably wanted me to talk, haven't I, John?
Well, this is probably going to last 2 hours instead of 1. No, I'm joking. Jack, I asked Jack McCallum, let me see if I can get him up on to pin him. There you go. Jack is a retired neurosurgeon, history PhD, and I asked him to initiate our comments / questions to you. Jack?
So 2 things, Bill. First, I did peds neurosurgery, and
Good.
I understand that you think we had to be told where to cut. I'll tell you what we
I
thought
know
about.
better than that.
I'll tell you what we thought about peds neurologists. Neurology is what you did while you were waiting for the scan.
Well, as there was a joke in medical economics with 2 neurosurgery residents standing around an MRI scanner, and he says, "It looks like the MRI is going to be negative. We better do an H&P." So
the other question, and this is just a random question. Did you, when you were at Louisville, did you overlap with Leland Albright?
oh, you bet I did before he went to Pittsburgh. Great guy. Yes.
There's something in the water at Louisville, because as you may know, Leland and I trained together.
I didn't know.
And as you may know, he went from peds neurosurgery. He's now a Lutheran pastor.
I did not know that. That's
Oh,
news.
yeah.
It doesn't surprise me, because what he was noted for was his bedside manner and how he talked with people. He was a great communicator.
Which brings me to the next real question in all of this. I've been thinking some about differences in how brains work when you do different things. When you do what we did for a living, clinically for a living, you spend your time doing analysis, and when you get to the results part, you spend your time either feeling responsible or guilty, depending on how stuff came out. That is almost all left brain stuff. The thing that I think is interesting is that what you've done and what Leland does now is not left brain stuff. Instead of responsibility and guilt, it's empathy. And there's a great deal of what you do that I think comes from a very different part of your brain. I really think it's different function. Do you have a sense of that? Do you feel that?
Uh, uh, in this, I don't know whether I've thought about it in terms of where it comes from. By the way, I'm left-handed. That's neither here nor there.
Well, you got a 50% chance of having a dominant right hemisphere then.
Yeah, I have. As I started into the days that I was doing that. By the way, one of the best things I had going at Brownsboro is a lot of the guys at here were, by the way, they're Vanderbilt trained neurosurgeons, and some from here. and I forgot another one, but they were doing things with vascular intervention that we were told never to do, like in stroke patients and things like that. But one of the things I became aware of was for 37 years in medicine, I probably should have been doing this in the first place because I enjoyed those 9 years so immensely. It seemed like that's perhaps where I should have been in the first place. But yes, within the context of the hospital, you're talking about neurosurgeons. My office was on a walkway between interventional vascular area and the ER. And it was not unusual to have a neurosurgeon stick his head through the door and said, "Here, go up to this area and see this person because they're going to surgery in a minute, and I want to know what you think spiritually and give them some support." I don't think I'm answering your question, by the way. Do you want to talk about history?
No.
But I think there has to be something that I'm not sure what it means and how one explains it, but I think the question is well, I don't know if that's the question or not. I think we're all capable of being compassionate and doing things that are outside the box of what is expected of us. One of the biggest problems I had with my residents on both in peds and in neurology was they never thought outside the medical paradigm. It was always the medical, which of course that's what they're being paid to do, but they didn't consider the other aspects of it. The other part of that is what it leads us to do is we found in Kentucky, we have 120 counties in Kentucky, and we have the area I grew up in downtown Louisville and Bell County are the two poorest zip codes in the state of Kentucky. So we got to learn what it meant to have poverty. Even if you have medicine available to you, you can't access it. And we started trying to find ways to, can you all hear the noise overhead here? The place sounds like there's a bowling alley above me. But trying to access medical care, if you don't have people in medicine who are compassionate and have some feeling about that, things don't happen. It politically, well, for instance, in the 90s, we established here in state of Kentucky Medicaid managed care. And I was asked to be on a committee, and we went to Frankfurt, our capital, and we set up what's going to be included, what is going to be in the package. And it didn't dawn on me how political this was, that politics became part of everything we did. And you had to have the political, and that was fairly well devoid of compassion and concern about other aspects, as far as I could tell anyway. Did I get anywhere near answering the question you asked?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's one of the really interesting things is that at least probably in neurology and certainly in neurosurgery,
Yeah.
we get a lot of training in the analytic parts, and we get a huge amount of training in the responsibility and guilt parts.
Yeah.
We get substantially no training in the other parts.
I think they're trying to make up for that a little bit right now, at least here at the University of Louisville. There are two fellows who are working a lot in that area, and a person who is in geriatric medicine too is doing the same thing, that giving some leadership to look at the ethical and the other social responsibilities part of it.
course, there's also the possibility that you can't do both at the same time.
Yeah, you have to have somebody to help. Somebody has
Yeah.
to do that.
Well, thanks. It's a great book, and I really enjoyed it. It's been fun listen to your stories.
Well, I'm glad to know that John knows a pediatric neurosurgeon.
Uh, Go ahead, Gary.
With me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna read you my, my question.
Okay. Is this going to be hard?
In 1973, I was a surgical intern at the University of Kentucky. At orientation, the chief of surgery, Ward Griffin, wrote in bold letters on the blackboard, CYA, cover your ass. After the meeting, my chief resident laughingly told me I could call him anytime, day or night, if I needed help, but it would be a sign of weakness. There was never anything mentioned about mental or spiritual support for our patients or ourselves. I think my experience was par for the course. I had plenty of professional support along the way, but there was always an underlying sense that seeking out help was a sign of weakness. Seeking out mental and spiritual help was not part of the program, a true sign of weakness. Today, according to Medscape, there is a major mental and spiritual crisis in medicine with burnout and suicide. Per capita, physicians have a higher rate of suicide than military veterans. This seems to be much worse now than when I was in practice. You having had a major burnout yourself, what steps would you recommend medical schools, residency programs, hospital staffs do to prevent this situation? And by the way, you may have run into one of my colleagues when I was an intern, a guy named Phil Tibbs, and Phil ended up as chairman of neurosurgery.
Right. You gave me a lot there. Phil Tibbs was chief resident neurosurgery when I started at UK in 77. And on Christmas Eve, it was the Monday after Christmas at the VA Hospital Cooper Drive, I went to the OR with Phil to drain a subdural off a vet who had been found down on Christmas Eve, but his family says you should not be in the hospital on Christmas. And they drained the subdural with a Black & Decker drill, and I remember being impressed as he poured in the mannitol and the swelling going down. The vet didn't make it, by the way, but they weren't going to let him be there. Yeah, because even on neurosurgery rotation, you were every other night at UK, and Phil Tibbs, Jim Bean, and that mob. I know all the people you're talking about. Yes. David Clark was our chief, as you probably might have known then. He was one of the fathers of pediatric neurology in the United States. I don't know the answer to your question, but I think now, and partly through the influence of developing in chaplaincy and other programs, there is more attention being given to the emotional side, but in some cases we have erred to the other side. My problem was I was the only child neurologist except for 1 year, and I was going in every day. I would go for 3 months without a day off. I was working on the average of 80 hours a week, and 70 hours was considered a short week. But in 93, I was burning out, and I basically, you could smell me coming. I was smoldering. And I left clinical medicine for 1 year and did administrative work and helped set up clinics around the state of Kentucky for kids who did not have tertiary pediatric care. And then came back a year later, and I learned how to handle it. But then I had open heart surgery for a valve repair in 2002, and that almost did me in, but I lasted another 5 beyond that. I'm not sure what drives. I think a lot of it is what we bring to it ourselves. But what I've seen happen is we now have 18 pediatric neurologists here at University of Louisville, and we have 11 in training. It's the 21st biggest child neurology training program in the country. But the question that the kids and the new faculty always ask, quote, how much protected time will I have? And if you'll also notice that at nighttime at the hospital, the only doctors there is the ER doc and a stray cardiologist here and there. And other than that, it's nurse practitioners and PAs running the floor in the private hospitals. I don't go to Norton Hospital for my care anymore. I had surgery recently. I went to the University of Louisville, and because I've had surgery there before. And if you go into an arrhythmia at 2 o'clock in the morning, all one needs to do is kick the door open and yell down the hall, is there a cardiologist around? And a cardiology fellow will be around and can, unlike the PA in the ER, he knows the difference between multiple PACs and AFib, and some don't. And primary care, they are a 9 to 5 job, and they get covered after dark by a nurse practitioner or a PA. And I love PA. I see a nurse practitioner sometimes, but I will tell you that if I'm sick, I want a board certified whatever seeing me, not somebody who is being simply. It's an economic thing. It's the hospitals that are driving this. This is my opinion, but I think there's a place for them, but I'm not sure where that place is yet. John, you're looking a smile on your face.
Well, I'm just saying, somebody put a chat in here. They said there's something in the water. It's bourbon.
Yes.
That's Howard Lovett, who grew up in Owensboro.
Well, I mean, Howard is right.
Yeah.
That's probably one of the problems we have here, and one of the good things we have for those who sip bourbon. If I drink 1.5 ounces of bourbon, I will have a throbbing migraine for 2 days. So I have a practical reason for not doing that. I will think I have a brain tumor.
Okay, Mike Stoltz, he was a nephrologist.
So I was a nephrologist, and of course, we had all of these chronic dialysis patients. We had transplant patients, and when we all started, we didn't have the immunosuppressive knowledge or drugs that we do.
Right.
The survival in all of these patients was very limited, to say, and we used to be dealing in, hey, if you lived 5 years, you were great. If you lived 10 years, my God, that was extremely great. We had a few people maybe lived 20, 25 years.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, we got to know these people almost like a GP.
Yeah.
One of the things that I noticed, and you sort of struck on this with hope and the economics of the patient, was that if you were Black and you were poor, you did a lot better on dialysis than someone who was upper middle class and fairly wealthy, because the poor people, number one, the Black people, especially the women, had a foundation in religion, basic religion, and they lived it. The men, not so much until they got older, but the white middle class guys and women that were in mainstream Protestantism, they had a lot more difficulty dealing with the chronic disease, the expectation of maybe not surviving and things like that. So they were more of a challenge than taking care of someone who was poor, and this was part of their life. They expected all this.
Yes.
The Jewish patients that I had seemed to do better than the mainstream Protestant patients, because somehow that faith, whether it was the Psalms or what was, they had more comfort in a bad situation like that. And the only other observation that I made that's changed, all the Catholic hospitals in Dallas and Fort Worth are gone. And they may not have had the best technical care in the hospital compared to some of the others, but those little nuns running around, the little priests coming by, you know, they had a, you know, just a better, you know, experience, if you can say it that way. That's all been lost.
I tend to agree with you in your observations, and you know, one of the things at the hospital was a Catholic Church since the Eucharistic ministers, which for the church near the hospital had a lot of nurses, retired nurses. But for those of you who don't know, the Eucharist, meaning the in some churches it's called the Lord's Supper or communion, but the wine and to a devout Catholic who is ill to have to receive the Eucharist every day, it has some spiritual effect on them, the way they saw things. And it was their ministry, their being there was really important. One of the best things about being a chaplain was, somebody said, you know, how did your being a Baptist or trained to affect that? Whatever you were, whatever was in the room theologically, I became that when I went in the room. I did not say, you have to be now, form up to what I believe. You listen to where they were in their journey. And I think you're right. It was amazing how even in a Pentecostal group who very much faith-based, you go in to see a Pentecostal and suddenly you realize that you went there to minister to them and they were ministering to you, and meeting your need at the time. One lady who had ovarian cancer and it was involving, she was having some invasion of her kidneys from her disease. And I went in to see her and just to talk with her. And that same 2 days before, my daughter, they had found a tumor in her right shoulder, which turned out to be okay. But she said, who is it in your family that's having trouble right now, Reverend Holmes? And I said, why do you think somebody is? She says, come on, I'm a Pentecostal. I can sense these things. And she said, well, I'm serious. But she said, let me pray for you and your family. So here she was praying for me in that room. And I had come to be, the chaplain got replaced. The patient became the chaplain. And that happened a couple of times during my lifespan, in that 9 years. But I agree with your observation. I agree with you. It's and it needs to be more said about that.
I really appreciate presentation. I enjoyed the book. My background is I'm observant in the Jewish faith.
Yeah.
I appreciate your telling us about the Psalms. You call them the Hebrew Psalms. We just call them the Psalms.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
They own it all.
Got it from us. I 100% agree with you about the value of a belief system when people come ill, and also in how we deal with people and try to offer some comfort. The world is becoming much more of a secular playground. I think that's to me, it's a source of a lot of the problems that we're seeing today, that society seems to have lost belief in just the basic values that we grew up with. How do you deal with a sick or dying patient that really doesn't have those expectations? They're just secular.
Yeah. They give us a census at the hospital, and oftentimes I don't think they do it anymore, but it would say what your faith base is, and it would be a nun, None. So we jokingly refer to the nuns. I enjoy going in to see nuns because when you sat down and got to hear them, they really did have some faith going on, but they didn't know what to call it. That they had some ideas and things, there were thoughts that they were having. But I I don't know the answer to your question, how you bring people, but it was not unusual that as more I listened to people who, by saying they didn't have faith, they just did not like the traditional church. They did not like whatever they came from or whatever their experience had been. But the my way of dealing with and listening to them, well, when I listened to them, which I didn't always do well, is I found out that there was some sign that you couldn't put a label on it, but there was a journey going on inwardly. And if it's inward, I attribute that to some sort of faith that they had, rightly or wrongly. And it was, it was, what was amazing was a part of that is people who came from traditional faiths who would say to me, do not tell people outside this room, but some of the things in my faith base I don't believe, but here's what I do believe. And it made no difference whether I agreed with it or not. The my feeling is that everybody has something going on within them that is somehow faith-based in orientation, but they just don't have a framework to hang it on that fits in what it goes into common everyday language. I don't know if I'm saying this right at all, but there is, I think there's something about us that I would say right now, let me just change it to myself. From the standpoint of faith, I am probably more disoriented now than I've ever been in my life about faith issues and what I actually believe, and my thoughts about God, and that has come about through my own illness, and then watching my wife dwindle away for 7 years with Alzheimer's, and then dying of a stroke. It changed who I am, to the point that I would have to, if I did a rewrite on some of these chapters, particularly the one on hope, it would look very much different than what it does right now. By the way, I was going to, you mentioned I have a good friend, as a young man who is a local rabbi. He trained up at Hebrew Union, and the guy is extremely brilliant. I know some of friends who, a friend of mine who goes up there and teaches secondarily, Walter Brueggemann. He's a brilliant kid. He has two problems. His dad is a very successful ophthalmologist, and his mother is a very successful pediatric physical rehab doc. And he has decided he wants to go to med school and become a psychiatrist, but he doesn't do time test very well. And he had a hard time with the MCAT. So I asked him if he ever heard of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So he got a lawyer in Philadelphia, and MCAT let him set for an untimed MCAT test, and he passed it. So now he is looking at what he's going to do if he's going to get into med school. I think he will be an excellent Freudian psychiatrist, or some sort of psychiatrist. But I can't wait, because I want to see the rabbi and the psychiatrist practice in some setting. He's a very different type young man. But I don't know why I wandered off on that, except you caused me to do it. So it was okay. I'm talking too much.
I have a question for you, Bill.
Yeah.
During your time in the wilderness, how depressed were you then?
Yeah.
Did you think about checking out? Was it?
Oh, no, I was never suicidal or something like that. No, I think that is that time, I don't know what medicine somebody offered me, and I took it for a while, and only found I like to sing and hum, And if I take a small dose of anything, I sing louder and I hum more. And then if I take a larger dose, I sing even louder and I hum even more. And we finally agreed that I was not an ideal candidate for antidepressants because my family started complaining about me because I would sing too much. But no, what I did was for treatment, went to I went to a monastery, in southern Indiana. It's actually St. Meinrad's. It is a Benedictine monastery, and the reason I liked it there is because Benedictines can talk, and those guys down there where Thomas Merton used to hang out, they can't talk. They have to be quiet, and I didn't want to be quiet, so I went there and got up at 5 a.m. and chanted psalms with the priest, with the novice priest, and then spent time with the students during the daytime, and spent 4 hours in complete silence every afternoon. And I got more out of that than nothing against my psychiatrist. He was a nice guy, still is, but I got more out of that and I did that for 6 years. Even after I went back to practicing again. But you cannot do 80-hour weeks for 13 years and expect to survive. We're just not put together like that. The other part of that was that, I got letter after letter from moms about thanking you for doing this for me and everything, except you can't be there at 2 a.m. And be there for people when they're at the worst time they're having in their life for everybody and expect to survive. It simply cannot be done. And I didn't learn that very well. I had to go back and take the course again to figure it out. So,
One other quickie.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh. May I ask a question?
Sure. Lee Anderson is an ophthalmologist.
Yeah, I'm one of the people that had to work for a living as an ophthalmologist.
Speaking, I'm not sure.
Anyway, I wanted to ask you about the laying on of hands, either as from the chaplain standpoint or physician standpoint. We were a retina specialist office, and back in the mid-80s, we saw a lot of people with AIDS and retinitis and from cytomegalovirus. It was just a really sad, poor situation. It was remarkable to me, and I never really realized it until this fellow told me one time. He said, "You touched my skin and you did not have a glove on. Thank you." It was amazing. I mean, it was just amazing. And I hadn't thought about it until he actually made that comment, because that just wasn't in my thinking. From a physician or clergy standpoint, it seems to me like the touch is still important.
I agree with you. Yes. And then with our society in some areas, being against touching or hugging, yeah, it is a problem. But there's actually even the formal laying on of hands that some people do, and the Pentecostals do that, and a lot of laying on of hands to as an indication of healing. It reminded me of in '79, I was doing a clinic in Hazard, Kentucky, in Perry County, which is a very poor county. I was there with a UK group, and word came that my father-in-law had dropped dead and was dead on arrival in the local emergency room with a heart attack. And the mothers all heard about it out in the waiting room. And I get teared up when I talk about this. And of course, in Perry County, Pentecostalism underlies a lot of their religion. And there was a knock on the door of the exam room, and the nurse said, "I need to interrupt you because I have a group of mothers who have heard what's happened, and they want to lay hands on you and pray." And I said, "What am I supposed to do?" They came in, they laid hands on me, and they prayed for me at the time. But the importance of I think that's a big thing. But in our sterile society, I don't know. embrace, I have to reduce it to the embrace. There has to be some form of embrace, either a strongly an emotional one. By the way, one of the things I like about going to the University of Louisville Hospital for my medical care is that I'm there with, when I went that morning for my surgery, I had a hernia repair by the doc there's also done other stuff on me before. He's the one that did the colon surgery. And when I went in that morning at 6 o'clock, sitting around me were two Hispanic families, an African-American family. And I liked being in that multicultural situation. And there is the best care I see is in the hospitals where they're training doctors and residents. Somebody said, well, no, they take the same history 4 times. And I said, good, somebody will have the right history and all of that. You get going over and over. Is that not right in neurosurgery? It takes 4 neurosurgeons to take a history. No, it takes multiple layers is what I'm saying. So
What's a history?
yeah. Okay. I'm lost on that one, but I think these are all good points that you give me something else to write on is what you're doing. Will there be a recording of this that I can have so I can go back over it?
Supposedly, this is all being recorded.
It says recording up here, and there's a red dot flashing up there.
I will, if it works, I'll get it to you. I
Yeah.
have, here we've said and listened to him, we've read the book. This is the kid that was banned from his neighbor's yard because of his foul mouth. And
That's right.
what, you mentioned this, and the 2 lay persons from the Baptist church who came.
Yeah.
And
I was downtown Louisville where I live, there was within walking distance Baptist, Methodist, Catholic, and Presbyterians. But if anybody knows Baptists, they're evangelicals. So they knock on doors. And it was a hot Sunday afternoon. And we lived in the first, at the time we had moved to the first floor, but there was, there was no air conditioning. But I was trying to climb the fence to my neighbor's yard. I impaled my right arm on one of these fences that had the prongs across the top that no one had bent over, and I got a 6-inch laceration. You want to see the scar? I'll show it to you. And I remember that very well. And I came into the house and to rest because I was getting dizzy. One reason I didn't go into surgery is that blood still bothers me, and I don't like that stuff. But when it was my blood, and my mother was screaming and yelling at me for doing this because she said, now I got to go up the street to the old Norton Hospital and get this sewed up, and that's going to cost me a paycheck. Actually, we've got the bill at home. It was like $22 to go to the ER and have your arm sewed up in 1956 or something like that. But 2 deacons dressed in suits came from a local church and knocked on the door and said, if you want to come to Sunday school, you can, if you'll come to Sunday school, you can play on the basketball team too. If you got to be in Sunday school twice a month in order to play on the basketball team or whatever team was available to you. And I loved basketball and I loved baseball, and I was never any good at any of them. So that's the reason I started going to church. It wasn't for religious reasons at all. The reason I stayed at church was not for religious reasons at all. It was because of the girls. So you had basketball and girls. And those were 2 highly motivating factors in the beginning of my religious experience. That you don't need to publish that, by the way. But it did change later on. So
you did. It's in your book. I said,
I know, well, I know, but it doesn't go into everything.
Bill, the Lord works in mysterious ways.
I would say yes. True.
Bill and I met back at the reunion. He said, Johnny, do you remember, I was president of the class the freshman year, And he said, and I met with the presidents of the classes. I had a luncheon with the dean every Friday. Don Smith was the dean. He was military. Not knowing Bill had been at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary the year before. Bill said, do you remember when you came out and told me that Dean Smith said he had seen that I was at an anti-Vietnam rally at the main campus? And I said, I don't know what.
It wasn't anti-Vietnam. It was public access for African Americans to restaurants and the bus station. Yeah.
And he said, tell Holmes, if I see him doing anything like that again, he's on medical school. And I don't remember that at all, but it's interesting what.
Yeah. Actually, John, what happened when I was a senior at Vanderbilt, we the only Black students on campus were graduate students, and I was a philosophy major. That's a good major for med school, by the way. And they had told the graduate students they couldn't come into the campus grill, which was a private grill right across from the library. And we were passing out pamphlets telling everybody not to come there, but not knowing that the dean was making a list of everything, and not knowing that the dean had handed over to the Nashville office of the FBI, and they put us on the watch list. And so that was apparently on my transcript when it came to Louisville, and they were demonstrating downtown, and the dean knew about that, but little did he know that I was working at night to come to medical school, and I had no time to do any demonstrations. But I was threatened during the pharmacology class, pharmacology lab, when we were in the break room. But little did he know that the chief of pharmacology was also president of the local chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. And that night, the ACLU called me at home and said, if you hear from them again, we will write a cease and desist letter to them. I never heard from the dean again. By the way, the dean left to become the dean at the University of South Florida, the new school that was being opened in 1967. He left, if you recall, he left the next year, but it wasn't because of me. But I blamed you for all of that, John, all of that trouble. So,
and the answer to why isn't Bill #1 in class? I knew how to take tests.
right, that's right.
Attention and knowledge. That's a different. Well, Bill, I want to thank you for being here. I've enjoyed it. I hope everybody else has. I think, you can expect maybe 20 more copies of your book to be sold.
Oh. I will have to say I wrote it as a gift. I've probably given away. I asked the publisher how many so far are either that have gone out, and it's 5,700. And I think I gave away half of those. So.
But did you tell me you get $3 for each one?
$1.50 from Amazon.
$3.
Amazon keeps all the money. You get $1.50 from Amazon,
There you go. That'd be $15 if I buy 10. Well, listen, thank you very much. Appreciate your time and what you've done.
I enjoyed it. And thank you. And I would, Jack, want to hear from you because I want to compare notes.
I'll get.
I would like that.
Okay.
Information.
A pediatric neurosurgeon. Now, I actually, if I did another thing, I love history. I'm Civil War and World War II mostly, and that's why I like the movie Oppenheimer. But I also, the other thing I'd like to do is go to law school and become the first non-Ivy League Supreme Court justice. Wouldn't it be great to have a U of L law graduate as in the Supreme Court?
There you go. Thank you very much.
Okay, guys. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. And now I'll shut it down.
Thank you, John, for putting it together, my friend.
Okay, Tom, good to see you, buddy. Tom Dees is an ex-partner of mine. He was military. He's up in the top. And he came in, and he and I were both guys who like to take charge.
John, do you know what you're doing?
No,
Okay, good.
okay. But
Thank you. Take care.
yeah, Tom's a good guy. Okay, shut down.